Greetings all. I think we can start. Just a very, very warm welcome to all of you. It's wonderful to have people here and just to have a chance to listen to each other, and as well as listen to some people from our network who have immense experience around peace building. So as we get started, please feel free to just type your name into the chat and just say where you are geographically. It's just nice to get a sense of where everyone is, and just make sure your names are up, which they all seem to be. So that's great. So the objective of today's roundtable is really just to bring everyone together, scholars, alumni, everyone who's got an interest in peace building. And what we want to do is just to open up a space that we can explore ideas and thinking, share our experiences, and just really to build connections so that going forward with the work that we're all doing in our different ways around peace building and transitional justice, we can support one another and engage more intentionally. So basically, we really hope that this event and our guests today will inspire us to be more effective in what we do, and also contribute to strengthening an inclusive network for peace building and social change and transitional justice. So just very quickly, I'm going to ask Nia if she would just put up a slide for us. Just some group guidelines, just to help us through the sort of virtual medium. Just if I can ask that we all be as fully attentive and present as possible, which means closing other windows and any distractions, emailing and so on. And also just to say that we embrace wherever you are. So if there's children or noises or whatever in the background, or you're outside, that's absolutely fine. And also just to make sure we have a space where everyone can be heard. So we're going to balance different perspectives and experiences. If you can, if your connection allows you, please use video as much as possible, because it's just nice to see people and get a sense of, we actually all faces and humans behind the name. We're going to try very hard to respect the time allocation that we've got here. We don't have breaks planned into the program. So if you do need to step out, just send a note in the chat and step out. And yeah, just bring your curiosity, your histories, your own narratives and experiences into the space. If Jeremy has already flagged that possibly his connection may go down, if anybody's connection goes down, know that we haven't gone anywhere. We're just going to try and get back up and running as quickly as possible. So just a brief outline of what we can expect today. We've got Jeremy Brickhill, who's our guest respondent, and we've got Darlington Tsuma, who is also a peace building activist. Both of whom are alumni of Canon Collins. Jeremy was saying before we started what a rich and long history he's had with IDAF and BDAF before the days of Canon Collins being formally formed even. So what we would like to do is just to get Jeremy to respond to a range of questions that are all related to peace building and transitional justice, and just have an opportunity to reflect on our roles in peace building from wherever we are and how we're working to effect change. Catherine has sent you all a very nice sort of flyer with some information around each person, but just a very brief introduction about Jeremy. You'll see from his bio, if you haven't had a chance to look, you could just pull it up and read it, because it's very detailed and gives a really nice overview. But essentially, he's a very deeply committed, engaged peace building activist. And he'll be in discussion with Darlington. So we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes for that discussion. You should all have a copy of the questions, but by way of reminder, Neo, you can just put up a slide. We've got those questions there. As we go through the discussion, we'll give Jeremy and Darlington a time to engage and converse. If you have any questions as we go along, just put them into the chat, please, and then I'll collate them as we're going along. And then once Jeremy has had a chance to respond to all those questions, we'll open the floor for further discussion, and people can present their questions or take them further, or we'll just have a more open space to engage. When we are in that open space, please can I just ask people that, and we'll remind you of this, but if you can keep your questions fairly brief, just to make sure that we do give as many people as possible a chance to ask their questions and to engage. So Jeremy, Darlington, I'm going to hand over to you to get us going with the meat of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill. I think when Catherine mentioned that she wanted us to do this, I was so excited and I didn't even hesitate, because Jeremy is someone whose work I've followed for some time. So when an opportunity presented itself, I jumped on it, and I hope our discussion today will illuminate some of those issues and also get us really thinking about some of the work that we do in our professional capacities, but also in our individual capacities. And to Jeremy specifically, thank you for accepting the invitation to converse with you today. So to start with, you've had a very impressive career. You've worked almost everywhere in the world, on very, very tense and sometimes complex situations. And I mean, I think everyone is in the room is interested to know how this has been, and your experience working on this on these dynamics from your work in Europe to Africa, to negotiating complex conflicts in Darfur and in Somalia. How has that been? And maybe we can start with that, with your experience, and you can share with us your work in that regard.
Thank you very much, Darlington. Let me just begin by greeting everyone and thanking you very much for inviting me to participate in this process. Well, so as for the question, it has had its ups and downs, some success and too many failures, actually. It's been a learning process, and that would always be my first piece of advice to anyone working on peace building. Listen and learn. And most importantly, listen to the national actors. Listen to both sides. Try to understand the circumstances and the reasons why people are engaged in conflict, even those with whom you disagree. But don't just listen to the power elite, the power players. Listen to all the voices, the rank and file fighters, obviously, but also the voices of the marginalized and the victims of conflict. Women's perspectives are always important, although they are almost always sidelined and kept out of formal mediation and negotiation processes. And that's a big mistake. I've learned a great deal about what is really going on from the woman in a conflict environment, although they don't seem to be involved in the conflict directly. The truth is that behind the scenes, women always play a critical role in conflict and in peace building, and especially in local mediation. I'm a frank sort of person, so I'm going to tell you that I'm always deeply disappointed when I come across high-ranking international special envoys and mediators in their Gucci suits who say things like, "Oh, why should I see so-and-so? Is he important?" This arrogance is far too common in the peace building business. And it's become a business, by the way. We might talk about that later. So I always escape from the posh hotels where the international elites are meeting with their counterparts, the national elites, and trying to make a deal which suits elite interests. That isn't sustainable peace building. I was an intelligence officer in ZIPRA, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, the military wing of Joshua Nkomo's ZAPU, during the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe. And that's where I learned the importance of listening and learning and of digging into the subsoil to understand what's really happening. In my career in peace building, I've usually worked as an advisor on the security dimensions of peace building. And I've learned that I can't offer meaningful advice just based on books or experts or theory. I need to really understand the context, and you won't find that context in a book or a five-star hotel. You will find it in the army barracks or the village or the street or in the forests where the conflict is actually taking place. The second important lesson I've learned is that every context is different. You can't use templates or simply transfer previous experience directly to a new environment. Of course, experience, especially real field-based experience, is very useful. You can take lessons and ideas forward, but don't expect that what worked in one context will work in another. Some specific tools and mechanisms might be transferable, but because each context is always different, you always need to develop a new strategy, which is appropriate to a new context. I have had to offer advice to far too many high-ranking UN officials and special envoys who arrive claiming to already know the solution to the conflict. And in fact, that attitude is usually a sign that they don't know the answers or even how to find them. So instead, they use a template from somewhere else, or they simply follow instructions from the senior politicians or donors. In either case, none of them have a clue about the particular context or conflict and are simply pursuing other interests. Which leads me to a third lesson. Peace building, mediation, and especially developing an appropriate strategy requires specific new knowledge and skills. A seasoned politician is not necessarily equipped with the skills to be a successful mediator. These new skills need to be learned. In my own sector, which is security arrangements, mediation, security transitions, and conflict mitigation and resolution, there are a very particular set of skills and capacities which are needed, and these are not taught in conventional military institutions. A senior general does not necessarily obtain any effective knowledge of negotiating or implementing post-conflict security arrangements from his peacetime or indeed his wartime experience or training. Negotiating and implementing a peace process requires an entirely new set of skills, and these need to be systematically developed through appropriate training and learning processes, and most especially those based on hard-won field experience. And this, by the way, applies to the mediation team and to the conflict parties. Training and building capacity of all the parties to manage the new challenges and the complexities of ending a conflict is, in my experience, an absolutely critical factor in effective peace building. And it's been avoided and ignored far too often. Too little attention has been paid to training generally, although this has started to improve in recent years. And in this regard, to all of you here, I want to congratulate Canon Collins Trust for investing in your education and training as peace builders. So those are three basic lessons I've learned. I would say, in conclusion on that question, we could and should be doing far better than we have been doing in addressing conflict and building sustainable peace.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think you raised a lot of important issues, especially, and I think this will link to the question of vastness, peace building being a business of sort, an enterprise. And then my question is, I mean, billions of dollars, and whether we're talking about Afghanistan or the UN peacekeeping mission in Somalia or in other parts of the world, billions are spent in these processes, peacekeeping, peace operations, missions, and all that. But we don't seem to be reaping the benefits. And then my question is, as an advisor, in your role as an advisor for some of the organizations and entities that you work, what is it that you were telling these people, and what is it that these institutions, I mean, from whether it's the World Bank, the UN, UNDP, and these other institutions, what is it that they're not getting right about the conflicts in Africa? And by Africa, I mean, I understand also that context is important, as you highlighted, but what is unique about the conflicts or the dynamics of the conflicts that we're experiencing on the continent, and what you think can be done better in terms both from the funders, the UN and the multilateral organizations, but also individuals and communities themselves? What is it that you think can be done better to either better understand our dynamics and also coming up with solutions or interventions that are probably more sustainable than what you are seeing?
Wow. Well, there's a lot to say about this question, and we could spend a whole day or even a week analyzing what's wrong. But let me just highlight a few key issues that I think are important. I've already spoken about the need for specialized professional training and building new capacities to address conflict. I've spoken about the need to listen and learn and to understand the context and to develop context-specific mediation and conflict resolution strategies. And don't rely on templates. And that's something that all these institutions do. They have a recipe book, and they bring that recipe book, that template from 1956 Suez conflict, and they attempt to implement it. Underlying these problems is the quick fix mentality, which is driven by political interests and donor impatience. You know, Western donors are like honeybees. They are always jumping from flower to flower, always in a hurry and impatient to find new sources of honey. But conflict mitigation and resolution is a complex challenge, and simple and quick remedies are seldom successful or sustainable. In the previous question, you mentioned 2 conflict countries in which I had been involved in the security arrangements, negotiations, and mediation, Darfur and Somalia. And so I'm going to use those to illustrate some of the problems. I'll start with the Abuja talks on Darfur, where I worked as an advisor to the African Union Special Envoy. The circumstances there were that we already had several really poorly drafted and failed ceasefire agreements, which had not been able to be implemented. We already also had a UN, Africa, AU, UN hybrid peacekeeping mission deployed in Darfur. But because the agreements that had been negotiated previously were so poorly drafted, that mission had no mandate, and it was simply watching the conflict helplessly. I proposed that we should focus on getting an agreement on a coherent first stage civilian protection and humanitarian ceasefire to replace all these confusing failed ceasefire agreements. And that this would provide an effective mission mandate for the existing peacekeeping forces. It was achievable and could be done, and it was a modest step. I also recommended that we should provide all the parties, including my own bosses, the head of the military commission and the special envoy, with training on ceasefire concepts and tools and strategies to build the capacity, confidence, and especially the parties' ownership. And this would help them to reach a meaningful and effective agreement. With regard to the training, I was told there wasn't enough time. And so we spent our days with the parties just denouncing each other every day, arguing about the previous agreements, why they'd failed, and blaming each other. Neither side could provide any effective or serious proposals because they had no idea what might be possible or effective. And I might add, the general who was my military commission boss also didn't know what he was talking about and had no understanding of the tools and concepts. And I mention that because you mustn't assume that these peacetime generals who go to staff colleges have any of the skills that are actually required to address ceasefire or conflict mitigation. They have other kinds of skills. These are new skills, as I mentioned before. Anyway, this went on for months, and apparently we had no time. My proposal that we should base our mediation strategy on an incremental approach and seek a kind of limited first stage civilian protection and humanitarian ceasefire, which was certainly achievable, and which would then enable the peacekeeping forces to actually engage effectively. That was rejected. And instead, the mediators attempted to force the parties to agree to a substantive ceasefire and a comprehensive peace agreement, including the economic, political, and social dimensions all at once. Well, as history can tell us, they failed and absolutely nothing was achieved. The AU officials in Abuja blamed this on the Western donors who were paying for this, and who they said had insisted on a quick fix, mainly because Darfur was in the news and the so-called war on terror was going badly, and they needed a good news diversion. They needed a photo of a peace agreement. Well, we achieved none of our objectives, and we walked away, leaving the people of Darfur to their fate. So what lessons can we learn from that, from this example? Be realistic about what the parties can actually agree on. Be prepared to take a modest step-by-step approach, which can achieve useful short-term objectives and create the foundation for future progress. Training and preparation are critically important. Don't avoid them, don't ignore them. And finally, be aware of the fact that donors and international actors generally have interests of their own, which may undermine effective peace building and may have nothing to do with that conflict. So let me turn to Somalia and give you a couple of lessons I learned over many years in Somalia. I've spent a lot of time in Somalia. Two important lessons are apparent, especially you asked about the African context. The first concerns the Western presumption, their assumption, their application of a false assumption. And it's in particular a Western state-driven fallacy, which has driven the peace-building process in Somalia, the Western peace-building process, but has actually simply sustained and deepened the conflict there. And that assumption is that state-building is necessarily the route to peace-building. But in Somalia, apart from the fact that the Somali experience of the post-independent state of Siad Barre was a bitter and tragic experience and makes them highly opposed to any reconstruction of a central state. The actual context in Somalia, the clanic nature of social, economic, and political life, means that a winner-take-all approach, where one clan, which gets hold of the presidency, can then dominate all the other clans, this is actually the critical cause of the next round of conflict. It's not a peace-building strategy, it's a conflict-inducing strategy. But that's what the West have pursued in Somalia for almost 35 years. And it's not a problem confined to Somalia, as many of you will know. You'll all know this. The failures and disappointments of the post-independent centralized state in Africa are the key causes of many of the conflicts in Africa. So simply imposing a new leader in an unreformed context is obviously not a sustainable peace-building strategy. It doesn't address the root causes of conflict. And it's very obviously, by the way, not an African solution to an African problem. Speaking of which, if you want an example of what that phrase should really mean, I want to recommend you have a look at a study by Interpeace. And except I'm not very good at technology, I would type it for you. Interpeace, all one word, formerly the War-Torn Societies Project. This study compares and contrasts over 90 successful locally mediated peace agreements in Somalia since the 90s. And it compares them with the 15 failed peace processes, which have been driven by the international community. There's some very important lessons to be learned. from that study, most importantly, that external actors should not try to impose their largely fanciful peace plans, and instead should start by trying to understand and learn from the local people and the local processes. Find out how local communities address conflict and manage it, what their traditions are, what the social formations are historically. And an alternative, which I would suggest you could also look at, will be found in Somaliland, contrasted with the conflict in Somalia. In Somaliland, a successful peace process was negotiated by the clan elders at Boroma, and an effective disarmament and ceasefire exercise was implemented by the elders, by community and religious leaders, and very importantly, by a highly effective peace campaign led by women. Interestingly, this disarmament exercise was not supported by the United Nations or any external donors, but it was locally grown and funded, and it was supported by a small team of advisors, Zimbabwean former combatants, who I had the privilege to lead on that mission. We'd all been fighters and had experienced disarmament and demobilization ourselves, and we were able to communicate with the Somaliland clan militias on that basis. They respected us and listened to our advice, which they clearly found helpful. And this South-South approach is something I'd also commend to all of you, where we share experiences in our continent. It's neglected, but it's a highly effective form of capacity building. The expertise we need exists because we've had conflicts and conflict management in Africa for a long time. We don't need to go to Rome, London, Paris, Geneva to find experts. We have experts among ourselves. I always try to find some advisors from local contexts who have some real field-based knowledge and experience that they can share, and it's always useful. Just in passing, I can't avoid saying, ironically, Somaliland, which has experienced 25 years of peace and several successful elections and peaceful transfers of power, it's still not recognized by the international community or the African Union. Somalia, on the other hand, which is a failed state and endures dreadful ongoing conflict, has a seat in the UN General Assembly and at the AU. I need to just touch on this issue too, if you don't mind. The war on terror dimension in the Somali context, where what are essentially territorial clan militias defending their clans against domination by other clans, including the president, who's simply a clan leader of himself, and are opposing foreign occupation. These are what are called Islamic terrorists in Somalia. And obviously there you have a recipe for al-Shabaab recruitment and endless conflict. And just like in Afghanistan, where there's a deep-rooted hostility to foreign occupation, which fueled the armed opposition for 20 years, in Somalia, you have a Muslim country, by the way, which had no previous interest in radical Islam before foreign troops arrived. And today it's occupied by troops from neighboring African Christian countries, including the long-standing rival Ethiopia. And this operation is funded by Western countries who've been engaged in a crusade against Muslims for the last 20 years. What do you expect Somalis will do in that context? This war of terror, as it should rightly be called, is another issue which we don't have time to go into today. But I do want to highlight one really important consequence which impacts on peace building. And this concerns the loss of legitimacy in the United Nations as an impartial peace builder and potential mediator of conflict. In Somalia today, UNDP trains and pays salaries for the police who are actively involved in the conflict and who have been responsible for numerous human rights violations, abuses, corruption, and are actually a clan militia, essentially just a clan militia themselves. By the way, the European Union pays for the foreign military presence. This kind of practice is common by the UN in many of the ongoing conflicts over the last 20 years. And over this period of time, the UN and the Western donors who preach building have lost the moral high ground and become protagonists actively involved in conflict. They've condoned terrible human rights abuses, allowed impunity, abandoned many of the important normative and international legal frameworks which addressed war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this has been a major setback for peace building globally. And it's the reason why reform of the UN system is so important, not just at Security Council level, but also throughout the entire agency system. And finally, on this issue, let me just add one other critical issue concerning the UN and other multilateral agencies, and that would enable me to respond to the question, what can be done? The multilateral agencies, including the UN and the AU, are mostly, not entirely, but mostly simply not fit for purpose in the peacebuilding arena, except perhaps with regard to peacekeeping missions. Even then, their behavior and abuse of local communities and women has been an embarrassing disgrace. The multilateral agencies are bureaucratic, disconnected from reality, and essentially driven by Western donor interests. And in our case in Africa, in collaboration with corrupt national elites. Essentially, in my view, they currently have almost no capability to engage effectively with meaningful peace building in the field. And that's because they're not in the field. They're in the five-star hotels or the heavily guarded compounds. The solution can be provided, I think, at least until we reform these multilateral dinosaur agencies. The solution can be provided with community-based and local NGO peace builders, supported by the more innovative capabilities of some international NGOs who actually do have skills and local knowledge and connections with people and local communities and aren't just connected to local power elites. So there you go. I'm quite critical, aren't I?
Thank you so much. I mean, you've painted a very, should I say, maybe great picture of the dynamics of what happens really at the level of the UN and African Union and these other multinational institutions. I want to touch specifically on you mentioned something about the loss of legitimacy when it comes to the UN. And I'll connect this to a speech or an address that you gave to the UN some few years ago, where you actually challenged them to, you challenged their approach to peace building and peacekeeping in Africa. And my question is, number one, what was their reaction to your criticism of their approach? And secondly, I get a sense that you seem to believe that community-based peace building, with maybe in partnership with genuine international partners, and I know there are quite a few. I mean, organizations like Peace Direct, Life and Peace Institute, who are of late trying to redirect their approaches. And if that is the future, or if that is the approach that we should be taking, then how do you then deal with the criticism that community-based peace building, in not entirely, but in majority of cases, it kind of struggles in, or they are not really capable of holding perpetrators accountable, which brings to the picture the issue of justice and justice on one hand and then peace building on the other. So how then do you reconcile these two?
Okay, so let me deal with the first part. The need to invest in localized, rooted, field-based peace building. It's very clear from all our experience that national ownership is the critical factor in effective and sustainable peace, and in security transformation processes, including security sector reform attempts all over Africa. The evidence is absolutely incontrovertible, so much so that even the donors and the UN and the other multilateral agencies claim to support national ownership, but they don't implement it in a serious or meaningful manner. And there is our problem. And when I talk about national ownership, I don't mean state or government ownership, as UNDP would have it, for example. I include citizen and community and women participation. For me, that's national ownership, the state and the citizens. And in that context, I've always taken local processes and community mediation and conflict management mitigation seriously and argued for inclusion of non-state and unarmed actors, including women. And on that basis, I've argued for the UN and international donors to invest in local peace initiatives, as you mentioned. And generally, my answer, they haven't done so. And it's been the international NGOs which have been more likely to work in partnership with local actors and local processes. In more recent years, the UN and donors have increasingly used private contractors as their implementing partners and agencies. And these profit-based organizations have made the situation even worse. It's the peace-building equivalent of Blackwater as a war-making operation. The problem with these profit-based organizations, they treat peace-building as if they're being contracted to build a road or a bridge. They look for outputs, not outcomes. And they operate for profit. And the major donors like the EU or multilateral agencies like UNDP have very easily adapted to this approach, which essentially addresses their own needs and interests, and it isn't complicated. Dealing with a local community peace-building initiative is complicated and challenging, and it requires you to leave your five-star hotel and listen to and learn from the natives, with all their confusing beliefs and their attitudes and their strange dietary habits. It's far easier to sign a contract with ABC Peace Builders Private Limited in a comfortable hotel lobby and let them get on with it. And as for ABC Peace Builders Private Limited, their only concern is profit and producing some visible outputs, like a technical training college for the demobilizing soldiers, which they can photograph and send to the donor. The fact that there are no jobs for those demobilizing soldiers to go to, and that after some time the government can't pay for the salaries of the teachers, and that the training school is now occupied by wild goats, it doesn't matter to them. They've produced an output, not an effective outcome. But who cares? And that's why you don't see meaningful outcome indicators in peace-building evaluations, by the way. So I think in retrospect, I was naive. I believed in the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness. And on that basis, I tried to build effective partnerships with donors and multilateral agencies, expecting them to uphold their part of the Paris Declaration. I haven't come across sustained donor or multilateral commitment to local peace processes in all my years of experience. You do come across individuals who do their best to work within the system. And I have great respect for those who are attempting to work within this dysfunctional system, and they find ways to make a difference. And you may come across a senior manager in the UN system who understands the need to work genuinely at grassroots level and is prepared to take risks to do so. But when his 3 or 4 year contract is over, the next manager might be a lazy bureaucrat who can't be bothered and is only interested in keeping his job and his promotion prospects. The system basically encourages mediocrity and self-interest, and crucially, not innovation. Local peace building is a risky enterprise. It's safer to work with a private contractor and just do the minimum and compile a report on outputs and send it to headquarters. So I think the current multilateral system is actually dysfunctional and it can't deliver what's required. We need a new approach. And in Africa, for example, if we believe that national ownership is critical, then we have to do away with donors and multilateral agencies who pretend to support national ownership, but actually constantly undermine it. And we have to pay for these processes ourselves and build our own agencies to support our own people and our communities in these efforts. In our case in Africa, this means that the African Union must also be totally transformed to serve the people and not the corrupt elites who have managed to ensconce themselves in power and are still in power 50 years after independence. The AU can't be serious when it relies on Western donors to pay the bulk of its core costs and almost all of its programming costs, and then claims to be working for African interests. That just doesn't make sense. African governments should be paying for the AU, and African resources, including human resources, including all of you, must be used to provide African solutions to African problems. There are some international actors whom we can partner with, and we've mentioned them, primarily international NGOs, but they are also dependent on Western donors, and you have to be aware of their limitations too. But I can't be so negative. You also have to be realistic. I'm speaking particularly to those of you who are embarking on a career in this field. Being realistic means we still have to work within the system and with the system. It's the system which currently exists, and we have to try to do our best, try to avoid being corrupted by the per diems, and at the same time struggle for changes and reforms, which are absolutely needed. But unless and until international donors and multilateral agencies are transformed and become real partners for peace and development, we should only sit at the table with them with very modest expectations and with a very long spoon. You know, Bob Marley said, none but ourselves can free ourselves. That's the way forward. You asked a second question, which is about the community peace building being unable basically to reconcile the conflict between accountability and peace building, or between justice and peace. And I think there are two important issues to be addressed here. And the first one is the question of local or grassroots peace building. And I'll use the Somali interpeace study as an example. And I'll quote from it. It's the same study of the 90 successful. It's an article I wrote, I'm quoting directly. Local Somali processes demonstrate indigenous demand for justice, security, and law and order, and a capacity in the absence of a state to control and manage conflict. Ending or de-escalating violence, establish public security, and instituting a fair judicial resolution are clear goals in local Somali peace processes. These local peace processes illustrate the rich traditions of mediation, reconciliation, consensus in Somali society. Consensus decision-making is a key principle of Somali peacemaking. As the parties in conflict have the power to reject any settlement they are not happy with, only decisions reached by consensus carry authority. So, summarizing what that means, any Somali traditional court or negotiating process which finds that a wrong has been committed requires that compensation is provided by the offender to the victim. No punishment, not punishment, but restitution, or what you referred to as restorative justice. And this is a common feature of all African traditional systems. It's why African traditional justice didn't need prisons. The consensus principle also ensures that all the parties to the dispute, including the victim, are satisfied. So I don't think you can say that this encourages impunity. In fact, I think we have a lot to learn from African peace-building tradition. As far as the second issue implied in your question is concerned, which is about this conflict between peace and justice, I think we can also find the first part of the answer from that same Somali example. The determinations they make are pragmatic, incremental, and avoid winner-take-all results. In other words, you won't find an immediate and achievable resolution, but you can find a way to contain and manage something, conflict, reopen a road, open a port, and you don't claim to have achieved a final resolution. And this is where the quick fix and over-ambitious attempts by international peacemakers to impose peace, as in the example I gave of Abuja talks on Darfur, and they usually fail and leave us with no progress and often do so much harm. We have to be so much more modest and realistic in this work and try to help parties make progress and move towards a substantive and sustainable resolution of conflict at their own pace. So we should aim to help parties achieve what they can and not attempt to force them to sign agreements they don't want and they can't implement. Ultimately, it's the parties to conflict who own the conflict, and they must own the peace. Outsiders, however well-intentioned, can't replace the parties. We should learn to be humble if we're going to support peacemaking. As for the second part of my personal answer, my personal observation on this issue, on what I learned from both my years in the liberation war as a soldier and a peace builder, I believe there is no sustainable peace without justice.
Very interesting insights, Jeremy, and I'm sure the chat box is people are burning to contribute or make suggestions. And I think one of the questions that has been raised, there are many, but one of the questions is around the concept of local. What constitutes local, or what do you mean by local? Is it the local elites, or maybe an international organization with a representative in Africa, or a regional office in Africa? What really constitutes local when you talk about peace building? And I think at this point, I also open up the discussion. And so those that want to pose questions can also, or intervene, can also share the questions in the chat box, and then we'll try and get a response from Jeremy. Yeah, so if you have interventions, burning issues, please feel free to post them in the chat, and then we'll respond along the way.
Just to say, we've got until about 20 past the hour, wherever you are geographically, and there are quite a few questions in the chat. I think it would be better for people to pose them individually, but if we get stuck, I'll go back and I'll just pick them up and throw them across to you, Darlington. But I think it's lovely for people to engage in person, so please do go ahead with that. Just try and keep your questions relatively short in consideration of others.
I think they can also use raise their hands on the item if they want to intervene here. I see there's Patrick and Dumisani, so maybe we'll start with Patrick and then we'll go to Dumisani. You are muted, Patrick.
Okay, thank you. Many thanks, Jeremy, for this interesting presentation. It's quite interesting, and it resonates with my findings in my field work in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and also the issue of peace and justice in northern Uganda, because I've also written about the contested nature of these two, which one should come first, peace or justice, in the context of the Lordist Resistance Army and the International Criminal Court. And now the Lordist Resistance Army is now based in Central Africa. They've just withdrawn from northern Uganda because they could not sign a peace agreement because of the indictments, the ICC indictments. But my question, it's just a follow-up to my question, which Darlington has also raised, relating to the local, which is also based on my fieldwork in Sierra Leone, because I did interviews in Freetown, in the three major cities, Freetown, Bo, Kenema, and also I visited the villages, some remote places in Sierra Leone, where it was even difficult to access some of the communities that I had to hire a motorbike. So these are the people I talked to. But in my interviews, I found out that they were quite dismissive of Freetown, for example. They would, especially those who were in the villages, they looked at Freetown. That is, this is where you find the elites, state elites based in Freetown, and they were quite dismissive of them as if they were in another world, and they tended to listen more to their paramount chiefs or traditional authorities than state elites, the politicians. And also, in terms of the local itself, it was also something that was also contested in the sense that even within those local communities in the villages, there were those who referred themselves to as indigenes, the real local, unlike those who migrated to those places. So they were quite dismissive of the other people who us as externals would consider as locals. So when you talk of, I do understand, and even in my book, Liberal Peace Building in Africa, I also talk about the need to look at the local context and also to understand the local context. What are the locals saying? At the same time, looking at how they've been resisting international peace building programs and how they've resisted hybridizing those peace building programs to suit the local context. But my question relates to the local. What exactly do you mean by the local? And when you talk of local ownership, what exactly do you mean by local ownership? Because it's also contested at the local level. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. And maybe we'll do Dumi and then acknowledge.
Okay, thanks. I hope you can hear me today. Can you hear me today? Okay,
yes,
great.
we can. Yeah.
I work day and night to get myself audible today. I want to. Hi, Jeremy. By the way, good to see you again. First of all, just to say that I work at a micro level. I'm not a big shot. I work at a village level, community level. But what I find is that the principles that you're mentioning are principles that apply even at a micro level. The issue of parachuting solutions still apply at a micro level. I'm a local. I work amongst what I would tell my people, but I still need to be very, very wary of how I deal with those conflicts that that I am assisting in, and be careful that I do not impose solutions that I come from me, or solutions that are based on my education and things like that. I always have to contextualize the theory that I know to the practical that is on the ground. And I think the idea of ownership and the idea of trying to help the communities themselves to find their own solution is key. But the thing that I've been thinking about and trying to work through is this whole issue of justice. It is true that there can never be peace without justice. But how do we define justice? And whose justice is it that we are talking about? Because I think that's what I've realized. I mean, most of my work, as you know, is with the issues around Burundi, and I'm finding it quite interesting to listen to what activists are saying and what the ordinary common victim is saying about what they need in as far as justice is concerned. So the activists, politicians, all the people up there have a sort of like a different concept of justice as opposed to what the actual people on the ground would want. So, while it's at the same time, I agree that, perhaps there is a need of some sort of balance. But, how do we balance that, and how do we actually make sure that at the end of the day, the justice that is satisfied is the justice of the victim, rather than, how we as intellectuals, how we as practitioners conceptualize justice to be.
All right. Thanks, Dumi. Acknowledge. You have the floor.
Thank you, Darlington, and greetings to everyone. I think one question that I have first is about something that Jeremy spoke about thinly about sustainable peace building. And I'm thinking the way the international community, and even at the local level, how civil organizations have conceptualized transitional justice. It's about the hard conventional way. How do we build sustainable peace in an environment where we have a context of an authoritarian non-transitional system where you have the perpetrators, they're still in power, but at the same point, you also want to build peace. I think this one specific context that Jeremy would need to respond to. And then the other thing is, I think Jeremy has mentioned more about the wrongs that the international agencies have also made in trying to find transitional justice processes. But I think in the context of Zimbabwe, I was also seeing a shift where international agencies are now kind of like funding national human rights institutions. And in such situations, you have less resources going to local actors like local NGOs, faith-based organizations. And at the end of the day, those national human rights institutions are actually not doing anything at the local level. They are not accessing local communities, the grassroots level where the money should actually get into. So with that shift of in terms of approach, how do we reconcile with the challenges that we still have in transitional justice process and peace building? Thank you.
Thank you, Acknowledge. And I think that there's still a lot of questions there's still questions that are coming. So maybe if we can just try and keep our questions short so that we have more time for a broader discussion, but also so that Jeremy can respond. Jeremy, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, well, I'm going to comply with your instruction by keeping my answers short. What very challenging questions. Patrick, starting with you. I think the whole point about local and our understanding of it, which was then explored by Dumisani, I thought in an interesting fashion, and you raised it in the context of West Africa, is all about understanding context and content. And I'm not going to attempt to answer that. I thought you both put the issues very clearly in front of us. And that's why so many of these ill thought through template interventions with parachutes from above cause so much damage. So my core point here would be how important it is, as I in the beginning said, listening and learning, but it's also about really making a serious situation analysis before you start fiddling and interfering and intervening. Really, you need to understand much more than just that broad-based template of conflict. I'd add to that the need for us to be much more modest, and I mentioned it, to be less ambitious. You know, I lived for 3 or 4 years in Somaliland, and one of the things I learned there, which I hadn't understood before, except in a liberation context, what I learned was that actually conflict isn't necessarily dysfunctional. You know, Somali clans have been using a combination of conflict and poetry for thousands of years to enable them to move their camels across contested grazing land. And when they were armed just with stones and arrows and wonderful poems, they did it every year, as if it was a shocking surprise. So they'd arrive in a valley and the kids would throw some stones at their camels, and then they'd throw a couple of spears at them, and then the elders would get together and say, come and talk, and then they would eat a meal together, and then the poets would share some poetry, and quite often some marriages would be arranged. And then the clan that was moving with its camels would depart and betray the clan that's just left to the next clan and it would all be a terrible shock. Nonsense. They did it every year. It was part of a way in which pastoralists were able to manage access to grazing. It was only when we poured heavy weaponry and modern weaponry into Somalia that this became a problem. Somalis have a great history of managing conflict through poetry. So that would be my sort of philosophical comment on this, that the modern contestations over politics and issues you've mentioned, like the elites, and also our context in Africa. Your comment, Patrick, about Freetown is a comment you can have in any African country. You know, who's taken power and on whose behalf are they ruling, and what does that mean, and how do we respond at local level? And that's why people are fighting back or demanding democracy, or demanding that the Chinese don't blow up the mountain. I live in a mountain here in Missouri. The Chinese are busy blowing it up, you know, to get the granite out of it. I might even go and dig up my whatchamacall, and, you know, because I don't want them to blow up my tiny little house here. So I don't have answers, but I thought the discussion really that you raised, the way you raised those questions, was very important in emphasizing the fact we shouldn't be trying to solve everything. We should just be trying to do the best we can, because the deeper problems are about the final question, which acknowledge you asked, and it's, for me, very simple. You sort of asked me, how do you build peace in an authoritarian environment? You fight for justice. That's what you do. I should mention, by the way, you know, that if there'd been donors and NGOs when I was young, I'm wondering if I would have actually joined the liberation struggle as an unpaid soldier, or whether I'd have joined the queue for per diems. And that, I think, is an important question to pose for all of you. And I'm posing it to you because you're younger than me, all of you. Are these donor-driven programs buying you off and in a sense, directing you towards what Ed Knowledge said, the higher level donor management jobs are where the money goes? It doesn't trickle down. And all of you want to get on with your life and hopefully have a happy life, have some children and survive, but you're still struggling for justice. And so how do you balance these things? It's a big, big problem, I think. We didn't have NGOs or any of this when I joined the struggle. You know, if you wanted to fight for justice, you went and fought for justice, and you hoped that somebody would find some sadza for you occasionally. But now we're living in this very contested environment in which peace builders themselves are an asset, and people are trying to get hold of those assets and use them to manage poverty, not to overthrow injustice, perhaps, or to co-opt us into being engaged in a nonsense kind of reconciliation process, like, for example, the current NPRC in Matabeleland and Midlands, and in my country, Zimbabwe. You know, it's obviously nonsense. However contested, and I take your point, acknowledge that there are different perspectives of what is justice. But the fact of the matter is that we are part of the contestation. You didn't ask me a question, and I'm going to answer it now, and then I'll be done. You asked me, why did I join the struggle for liberation? And I've got an answer in 2 words: my mother. My mother. She taught me to be proud and be proud of the fact that I treated everybody with respect. And so there's a kind of ethical, moral issue behind all of this. Thank you, Mum. Back to you, Darlington.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think this has been a very informative discussion. I don't know, I see that there's a hand, so I think Nompilo, I'll give you an opportunity to ask your question.
Thank you, Darlington. Greetings, everyone from Cape Town, South Africa. Jeremy, you'll be interested to know I'm recently returned from UNAMID, the the peacekeeping mission in Darfur. I worked in the Chief of Staff's office for about a year, and usually the code cables that were going to headquarters were being written by either me or somebody else in the office. But it is a failed peacekeeping mission, as you know. That's why it has shut down after so many years, because they couldn't prove why so much money was going in and peace wasn't being sustained. So it was quite interesting to hear your views on the UN, having had been living in Darfur recently. I don't know whether I have questions as much as I have comments. One of your ideas was that South to South dealings, especially with peace building, are a little bit more ideal in the African context, which I tend to agree with, but I do worry about the fact that even when you talk about South to South, there are hegemonies. So even if you want to talk about the African Union alone, you know that Nigeria is a hegemony in West Africa. South Africa believes it's a hegemony in Southern Africa. And I mean, if we're talking about South to South and we're talking about Brazil and India, then there are also different power balances there. So I don't necessarily think that South to South itself solves the power intricacies that are there with nations, some having populations in the millions and others like Botswana having populations like 3 million. So I think there's a lot more that can be said about South to South interaction, because they don't necessarily represent equality. They could also be spaces of disadvantage. So I panic every time people say SADC and they use an overall blanket, because I usually realize that smaller countries like Malawi are usually not being heard, because South Africa, which has the strongest economy, kind of takes over. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that also I'm concerned about the romanticization of the term local level and the idea that they are homogenous, because if we are honest, a lot of local institutions lack resources. They struggle to formalize, especially administrative wise. And I've also seen a lot the idea push forth that indigenous peace building works more than anything else. And some of these, especially in more conservative places, cause harm if they are patriarchal spaces. So when we think about Mata Oput in Uganda, Gachacha courts in Rwanda, even if I think about my own people, like if the chief in a local village in Matabele and North calls people, it's likely going to be a patriarchal space, right? So the judgment that will be given for a woman who has done harm or something won't be the same if she's not able to represent herself, if she's sitting on the floor and everybody else is sitting on the chair, or if she's actually not taught to speak in places where men are. So there's this whole idea that that which is indigenous is better, but there's also a lot of like human rights that are actually human rights things that are not followed properly in those spaces as well. So, I mean, I do agree that not everything state level or international level is good, but not everything indigenous level is progressive either. My other issue about local level and indigenous level ideas is that a lot of that stuff happens in the rural areas. Now, when I did my PhD, which was on peace building, especially around Kukurahundi, a lot of the people I was asking was, what do you want to see happening to solve the problem? And a lot of them were saying, this thing needs isigo. It needs us to go back to, I'd need someone to translate isigo to English. It needs tradition. Tradition, yeah. Yeah, just to solve it, right? And if you think about, say, the number of people I interviewed over 5 years, a lot of them were in the rural spaces, but I was actually just like, if you are passing on that baton to the next generation, to follow isigo, to cleanse the blood and the land, many of those people are living in urban spaces and they don't know what isigo is and they don't know how to follow it. So there's a different generation, there's a different locality. And what happens to people who died in a rural area when you follow isigo in the urban area? So there's also that idea of local level and indigenous being rural, and also us having to be serious about the fact that most people are moving from rural areas to urban areas. So what does locality and indigeneity look like in peace building when you are in Bulawayo and Harare and not in Filabusi? Yeah, those are the two things I wanted to raise.
Thank you, Nompilo. Maybe Jeremy, you can intervene and respond.
First, to say what a fascinating discussion, and the depth and complexities are precisely the point. I think romanticizing local, if I've done that, please forgive me, because it's not a solution. It's an element of entry that's been, generally speaking, ignored or avoided by the institutional responses to conflict and peace building historically, and therefore it needs to be explored, but it's not a nirvana for us. And I think your in particular attempt to situate, for example, the processes of dealing with the past in the Gokurahundi context is a very good example, because that's, as you point out, a patriarchal space, and tradition has both positive and negative impacts on that. And we will see if, for example, in this context, the chiefs are bought off or not, because that's currently what's on offer. You know, everybody else is getting a car, they might as well get another one. And so the question is going to be, will they represent the interests of people? And that's class and resource-based conflicts. So I don't have the answers to this, but I think there's quite an interesting one point I wanted to pick up. I'm not claiming to understand how, other than that the complexities and the need to understand and be much more modest and less prescriptive in our work is important. I've found that important. But you raised the point about South-to-South experiences and exchanging experience, and I'd raised it. I'm not really talking about the institutions. I don't think SADC and IGAD will ever teach each other anything other than how to claim effective expenses for the trips. What I was really getting at was South-to-South experience of this sort that we've had today. I've learned just in the short time, and I wish there'd been more of this. So one of my thoughts is, are you creating these kind of spaces for this kind of exchange of information, which I think would be incredibly important? Not SADC, not the AU, not bloody UNDP, but those of you, us, who are working on this, who can share knowledge and experience. And when I was talking about, I always try to look for South-South advisors. You know, it's, for example, when I went to Darfur, I took Somaliland militia leaders with me to try to talk to the Darfurian militia, to share experiences. When I went to work in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement with General Sambewu as his advisor in North-South Sudan, I took a Zanla fighter with me to work with John Garang, because Zanla and SPLMA are like cousins, you know, they're really peasant-based movements that, and it helped, it worked. So that's the kind of thing I think might be interesting for Canon Collins Trust to explore. And I hope Darlington and others who are able to raise these issues could suggest it, apart from helping support your training and your research and so on. Is there space for something like this? The bureaucrats won't like it because they like to control, but I think you should consider it. So that's my comment, especially to you, Mount Global, that we should be thinking of sharing these experiences and providing solidarity to each other. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And this has been a very lively discussion, and I've learned a lot, and particularly on the last point that you made on creating experience sharing, in particular for you know, amongst ourselves as you know, academics, researchers, and all that. That's a topic that Gillian will address just now. So I think I'll hand over to Gillian to talk about that. And really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for coming through and sharing your experience, and also to everyone here present who's you know, shared their experiences and talk. I hope we can continue this conversation and see how we, in our small ways and small and unique ways, how we can help push the conversation, but more than that, also how we can develop solutions that potentially can work in our communities. So I'll hand over to Gillian. Or maybe before Gillian comes in, Jeremy, you can say something.
I've got a gift for all of you, and I'm about to post that gift. It's a poem, and it's a poem that was written by Freedom Nyamubaya, now late, who was a Zanla field commander, a female, one of the very few female field commanders during the liberation struggle. a feminist and a wonderful revolutionary who could have enjoyed all the best. She was senior to my Mujuru in real terms. She could have had everything. She could have kept quiet and she could have enjoyed all the riches that are on offer to those who compromise, but she didn't. She stayed in the rural areas after liberation, refused all the government posts and promotions, and worked with rural people on development, justice, and peace issues. She was a close friend and comrade of mine, and we worked together on the Zimbabwe Peace and Security Program. And I wanted to leave you with that poem. I'm inviting you to please Google her name, Freedom Nyamubaya, and look for that particular poem, A Mysterious Marriage. This poetry of hers should be in our school's curriculum. It's not. And she's not recognized by the current leadership because she posed critical challenges. And I wanted to end what I had to say today by saying something she always used to say to me. Jeremy, freedom is not a destination, but it is a lifelong journey. So I leave you with that comment.